All right, I think those are the big announcements that I have for you. Questions for today. As we progress through the presentation, you are going to have questions. You already have a list of them in your mind right now. We're going to ask you to put those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. Feel free to use chat for remarks and things like that, interacting. We want your questions in the Q&A box so that we don't lose track of them. And Brett's got some kind of fun ways to kind of engage you and pick up on those. So we'll kind of be picking up some of those questions throughout, and anything we don't, we will answer at the end of the day. Last thing is, while Brett is an actual attorney, this is not legal advice. This is educational and best practices. You should be consulting with your legal counsel or your leadership team on specific examples that you might have. So with that, I want to hand things over to Alicia Venice. They are with Star Staffing, a great partner to the association. We welcome you and we thank you so much for sponsoring today's session.
Thank you, Sloan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am so grateful to be a part of WMFHA. We are located in Portland, Oregon, well, rather in Camas, Washington. I am third generation property manager, and I have owned the company now for 3 years. I started it after I left the property management industry, and I was going to go to law school, but then people like Brett kind of scared me away from that. So I decided to start a staffing company here in Southwest Washington. The company did so well in the past 3 years that we are now ready to scale. So we are moving into the Eugene, Oregon market and the Seattle, Washington market, and providing temporary staff and recruitment services to property managers. Our staffing company is niche. I don't do anything other than property management. In fact, you probably don't want me to do anything other than property management because I've been doing it for so long. And I'm just here today learning from Brett and from all of the other speakers. And we will start staffing here at the end of January in Seattle. So if you do need staff, we are around. My brother is our sales manager up in the Seattle area. So if you ever need to reach out to him or to me, his name is Josh, and he's also on today's platform as well. So we are here if you need us for your staffing and recruitment needs. And Sloan knows how to find us.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Alicia, and to your family and your team. I did drop the link to their directory listing. Remember, mum's the word, members using members. So if you have a staffing need, we encourage you to go first to the WMFHA directory. Those are the companies that are dedicated to property management. And you can find Alicia and her team through that directory listing. And I will say, I know Alicia's been attending all of the sessions, so she's definitely educating herself, keeping herself updated, and we appreciate that. Amanda says, oh, I wish you were on the east side. Amanda's with our Eastern Washington market. So maybe eventually.
I can be, Amanda. Just let me, I'll be anywhere you want me to be.
All right. Well, I'll let you guys talk about that offline. All right. Thank you. All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and hand things off to Brett Waller, our Director of Government Affairs, also known as the Boy Wonder, your advocate in Olympia and the city of Seattle. Brett, thank you so much, and take us away.
Thank you, Sloan. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Good Wednesday morning. It's the third day of the legislative session, so you know things are popping down there. There's lots of changes that are proposed. I don't think that we're going to get into that much today because that is not the law. But we will talk about some changes that occurred last year, some changes that actually occurred in 2020 as well. If you can imagine, there were laws that were passed in 2020 that you probably have not even implemented or thought about yet as you are managing your communities across the state. So we'll talk about those as well. I'll try to go through and answer some questions throughout. And hopefully there's some time at the end that we can talk about some, answer some more questions that we didn't. But thank you all for joining this great week of education around our virtual legal symposium. So to start with this morning, I wanted to get you all to participate in a little word cloud for me. So if you jump on to slido.com or use the QR code, you can add what is your most, what are you most interested in learning about today? I added late fees because, as it turns out, late fees is a really big issue right now, as it's the 12th of the month, and we are rolling off of the eviction moratorium. So go in and add, use the QR code and add this word cloud, and we'll try and work through this throughout the presentation. Sloan's going to help me with those high priority issues, ERPP, yeah. Some of this stuff we may talk about tomorrow in our post-COVID operations. Evictions, non-renewals, late fees, 10%, 10-day notices. Violations, non-rent balances. So some of this stuff we're going to talk about tomorrow in both sessions. One is tomorrow we have our just cause eviction section, which is going to talk about just cause eviction, which was passed at the state level last year. Obviously, there are some jurisdictions across the state that already have just cause eviction, like Seattle. Christopher just talked about that a little bit. And I know that we'll get into 10-day notices tomorrow as well. And then also post-COVID operations, that's an important piece as well. Some of the specific policies that are required in different jurisdictions and including at the state level as we move forward. So we'll definitely talk about those things tomorrow. I would be remiss if I didn't add already this morning that in between the time that Christopher finished speaking about Seattle and all the laws that were passed over the past year and the start of this session, Mayor Harrell announced that he's going to extend the eviction moratorium for 30 days. There are some additional conditions that go along with that. And so there's an additional 30-day time frame that's going to be added to Seattle's eviction moratorium. But he's committed to creating a stakeholder group and trying to work through, we'll call it the mess that is landlord-tenant law in Seattle. So let's move forward here a little bit. This whole session today is really going to be about the basics of landlord-tenant law. It's going to focus primarily on the state level laws, but I do pepper in some local jurisdiction laws around specific issues like late fees and other things that I know are important to you, especially if you operate in specific jurisdictions. So just remember as we go through today, the majority of these laws are going to apply to the entire state. And we will talk about specific things that occur in different jurisdictions. That resource that we provided to you that's on Open Water has a summary of all of the entire RLTA. And if you look at the table of contents, it's actually linked to different sections of different jurisdictions that have more specific laws that you should follow moving forward. It also has a specific section around the COVID-19 operations and different specific guidelines that occur at the state level and at local jurisdictions. So that's something to look at as well. And obviously, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me or to your attorneys to identify and answer that question. So the first thing we have here, well, the way I try and create my presentation is to look at the life cycle of the tenancy. I think it's really important to look at the life cycle of the tenancy and understand, things that happen at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end of the tenancy. And so we'll try and talk through that today. First thing is source of income. This is actually something I think that came up yesterday in the training seminar for those of you that attended that. So at the state level, there's a state law that requires that a housing provider cannot deny an applicant simply because of the type of income that they're trying to use to pay their rent or proposing to use to pay their rent. Unless there are a couple exceptions, unless the prospective tenant's income is based on a housing inspection and the cost to improve any repairs that are required as a result of that housing inspection exceeds $1,500. And of course, you haven't received any money from the landlord mitigation fund to make those repairs. So that's something we might talk about today with the landlord mitigation fund and how you can actually be reimbursed to provide and make improvements to your property to meet housing inspection with Section 8. So what does source of income cover? Source of income includes benefits or subsidy programs. That's going to be things like Section 8 or public assistance. Emergency rental assistance is included in there from the perspective of multiple months of emergency rental assistance, veterans benefits, Social Security, supplemental security income, or other retirement programs. It does not include income that's received from an illegal manner. So I know one of the questions yesterday, Sloan and I talked about this a little bit around source of income, was can you deny an applicant that is proposing to pay their rent with a subsidy that's only going to be guaranteed for 2 months? And the answer is no. You're going to look at the, Christian is the speaker yesterday. Christian said, you're going to look at the here and now. And currently, does that employee or is that prospective resident, do they qualify based upon the income that they're proposing to pay the rent with now? And when you think about it, it's kind of the same thing that you do with other residents that have a job. You don't know that your resident, that your applicant that is applying today is not going to have a job tomorrow or next week or in 6 weeks. And so the kind of the same thing applies. And we don't look typically at how much savings someone might have in the bank to make sure that they're going to be able to pay their rent through the life of the lease. So you really focus on what is that person's current income, including their subsidies, and make a determination of whether they qualify based upon that current income and those current subsidies. A lot of times with some of the emergency rental assistance programs, tenants who are unable to meet their basic needs, including their housing, their rent, after the temporary period of that housing subsidy it is possible for them to go back and get a little bit longer of a subsidy in some cases. Not all subsidies are the same, of course, and that's something that you just want to be aware of as you are moving forward with your residents. One important piece to know too is income to rent ratio. Oftentimes you have a income to rent ratio in your screening criteria where a resident needs to earn 2.5 times or 3 times the monthly rent in order to qualify to rent a particular home in your community. When that works with a subsidy, you actually are required to deduct the subsidy from the rental amount prior to determining qualification. So any subsidy or rent voucher must first be deducted from that rent prior to calculating the income to rent ratio. Anything that's paid, so when you're thinking about this too, it's anything that's paid to the landlord directly from the subsidy provider. So something like Social Security income, if we go backwards a second, anything like Social Security income or supplemental security income that the tenant is going to receive directly is not something that you're going to deduct from the rent prior to determining income to rent ratio. But some sort of a voucher or temporary housing subsidy that is paid directly to you is something that you are going to deduct. And then new in 2020, this is something that you are probably unfamiliar with unless you're in the city of Seattle. This has been the law in the city of Seattle for a while, but this is something that's new in 2020 across the state of Washington. A landlord is required to accept a community pledge prior to the expiration of a 14-day notice when that pledge covers the entire amount owing for the rental agreement, or after the expiration of the 14-day notice when the pledge, together with any other money, covers the full amount of the rent owing and any other costs that have been incurred as a result of that non-payment of rent. What's important about this is a community pledge is actually not money in hand. Community pledge is a commitment to pay. And typically that commitment to pay is in 7 to 10 days. And there's going to be a process of information. You're probably going to have to provide your W-9 and some other information if you haven't worked with that service provider before. But this is something to know as we move forward in the 14-day notice process and serving 14-day notices again, that if you receive an offer of a community pledge that pays the entire amount of the rent owing prior to the 14-day notice or after, together with other funds, you are required to accept that money. Keep in mind that the law does say that if the proposed payment does not cover the entire amount of the rent owing or requires you to accept additional conditions along with acceptance of that rent, you can deny or refuse to accept that sort of emergency rental assistance that exists. I'm just going to look at some questions here. Does unemployment income account as well? Yes, it does. Unemployment income is going to be treated just like Social Security income or supplemental security income. That's income that's paid to the tenant, and it can be used for whatever purpose. So you're going to consider that as a source of income when you're qualifying a resident to see whether they qualify to live in your community. Now that the IRS has stated that citizens should claim money received from theft be claimed for taxes, would we have to consider that income for qualifying? I think you really want to focus on what is a regular source of income that a tenant receives. I'm not too familiar with this question or the contents of this question in terms of the IRS claiming money received from theft. But if it's a regular source of income and it's not illegal, then it is something that you should consider when you're qualifying an applicant. We answered the source of income question. Must we accept a community pledge for move-in costs? You don't have to. There's no requirement in the law that specifically says you have to accept a community pledge for moving costs. Typically, those providers are going to pay that more quickly because they're going to want to get folks into housing. So there is nothing specific in the law that says that you have to accept a community pledge for move-in costs or non-rent related costs, but it is a good practice to consider. Do late fees stop once the community pledge is received? Yes, you would stop accruing late fees once the community pledge is received in the community. What about only cash income? Cash is income. I mean, you answered your own question. What about cash income? Someone is paid in cash. That's something that frequently happens. I know there's some issues with the city of Seattle and the MFT program and having to identify and describe payments that are made through Venmo or other money sharing apps. I can't think of the exact name for those, but like Zelle or Venmo, or there are people who actually do transactions and run businesses through those. So that's something to consider when you're looking at that. So yeah. The landlord's duties. This is something that's really important. These are things that you are required to do to maintain your property. Some of them are, what they are already, and you commonly do them. That's like premises need to be fit for human habitation. It means the walls need to be sealed, the roof needs to be sealed. There can't be animals running around. It needs to be someplace where you would want to live, maybe. You need to maintain the structural components in a reasonably good repair for use by tenants. That doesn't mean they need to be perfect. That just means that you can't have water coming in a crack between the roof and the wall. You want to keep the shared common areas reasonably clean, sanitary, and safe from defects. I would say that most, if not all of our members do a great job of keeping the communities clean. They regularly walk around and clean up garbage that's inadvertently dropped, or the community spaces have been used and need to, the lights went out, need to be just cleaned up a little bit after someone uses a party. But it is something to remember. One thing that I think about a lot when I live in an apartment is it's always great to see the team walking around and viewing the community and making sure that everything looks reasonably clean, sanitary, and because your residents notice that when they use the same door every day to enter and leave their apartment, and they see the same dirty mask. We'll use that because everyone has to wear a mask right now. A dirty mask by the front door that's been there for a week. You see that, and it's something simple that can be taken care of, but it's also something that can be simply avoided by just taking a break. Maybe it's a break or a morning stroll through the community just to see if there's anything that needs to be touched up. Provide a reasonable program for the control an infestation of insects, rodents, and other pests. I would bet that almost everyone on this call today at their property, they have some sort of a pest control program, a professional pest control program that comes out and addresses pests and regularly inspects for insects. And you've got the little black boxes in your garages and in different parts of your community to make sure that you're capturing any pests or insects that come up. But also making sure that when you have a resident that complains about a pest, some sort of an infestation, that you're addressing that reasonably quickly. You want to make repairs and arrangements for repairs to keep the premises in good condition. That means the entire common space. If there's a hole in the wall, if for some reason the door goes through the wall behind it, it's something that you want to repair in a reasonably quick time. The same is true about issues and maintenance issues that happen in your apartment, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Provide reasonably adequate locks. That means that the doors for the apartment homes needs to be able to lock. They need to be able to lock individually, and you need to make sure that if you have any master keys, that those are safeguarded and locked up so that they are not readily accessible to internal or external individuals who would see some benefit from having a master key. Maintain all electrical, plumbing, and heating and other facilities and appliances in reasonably good working order. This is just about making sure that those systems that are necessary to be provided, electric, heat, water, that they're working well. And if something happens to them, you're on top of it and make sure that they get fixed. The same is true for appliances. You're not necessarily going to know that an appliance is going to break, but if a resident indicates that one of their appliances is not working well, you want to jump on that and make sure that you're trying to take care of it. Maintain the presence in a reasonably weather-tight condition. I think this makes sense. We talked about this a little bit. You don't want water on the inside. Water is always is best served on the outside. And then maintain receptacles in the common areas to remove rubbish and garbage, recycling and compost. You want to make sure that you're providing sufficient opportunities for residents to dispose of their waste. That's garbage cans through the garbage chute and those sorts of things. I know sometimes the garbage chute breaks down and it's a big inconvenience for everyone, right? But you have to make sure that you're continuously maintaining those garbage rooms and any other common area garbage rooms as well inside. It's kind of redundant, but you want to supply heat and water, including hot water. Sometimes those sometimes that goes out and you'll have to address that and we'll get to that in a second. In your lease, you want to provide written notice of fire safety and protection information. This is a really important issue right now. If you've seen the news back in Philadelphia and New York City, there have been two very tragic fires that have resulted from we believe tenant caused issues, but they've resulted in a number of deaths. And so that's going to put some renewed focus on multifamily properties where you've got a lot of people in one building and making sure that they're safe. So you want to make sure that your fire life safety systems are up to date and working properly. There was a fire, actually, just personal example. There was a fire in my building a couple months ago, and I ended up sleeping through the alarm. I woke up and I thought it was my own alarm and then went back to sleep. Turns out the fire was right across the hall from my apartment building or from my apartment. And so that's probably not a good look for me. But I'm happy that there were the fire alarms available. I should have taken a greater interest in the noise in the middle of the night. You want to provide information from the Department of Health on the health hazards of indoor mold. So these are all things that you're going to be providing to your residents when they apply and with the lease packet. And then finally, I know this is something that Christopher touched on in the city of Seattle in a prior session this morning, but it's about providing the lease, a copy of the lease to the resident. You're going to provide one copy of the lease to each resident. The state law does not specify how that needs to be provided. So under the state law, you can provide that electronically. But if they ask for a paper copy, you want to be willing to be able to provide that paper copy to them as well. And then each tenant may receive one additional free copy of the lease or one free replacement copy of the move-in checklist. Repair of defective conditions. See, I said we get here. So you always want to commence remedial action by the following days and times. That doesn't mean that you need to complete that action. And oftentimes right now, especially with all our supply chain issues and other issues that are occurring within our broader economy, it can be difficult sometimes to get the supplies that are necessary to fix certain things. So if it's affects hot or cold water, heat, electricity, or is imminently hazardous to life, you want to commence that remedial action within 24 hours. And I would highly recommend that if you can't fix that issue in 1 to 2 days, that you just maintain an open dialogue and open communication with your residents, describing some of the challenges that you're experiencing or that your suppliers are experiencing in providing the tools that are necessary to repair that condition. If you can't get a refrigerator for a few weeks, or then maybe look for someplace else, but keep that open communication, because you don't want to have an angry tenant because they just don't know what's going on and they're just waiting for you to provide them with a new refrigerator. 72 hours where the defective condition deprives the tenant the use of a refrigerator, range, oven, or a major plumbing fixture. So like I said, if you can't get that refrigerator in 3 days, the suppliers are backed up, they can't find adequate supply of new refrigerators, just communicate with that resident and try and find an alternative option that's going to work for them and work for you at the same time. For everything else that's not identified within these two, it's not a defective condition that affects is hazardous to life, or doesn't address an appliance or some other fixture that's attached to the building or to the property, the unit itself, then it's 10 days. Maybe that's a light bulb, or they want a wall repainted because they scratched it, or something like that. But always maintain a good and open dialogue with your residents when they've submitted maintenance requests and maybe you can't get to it. You've got too many maintenance requests and it's taking you too long and you're short on staff and maintenance professionals to get to all the maintenance requests that are being submitted. Just keep an open dialogue, because that's going to really help you in the long run maintain a good quality community with quality residents who respect and appreciate you on the site level. The tenant does have a right of repair, and we can go through this. I might just jump ahead simply because it's not something that happens very often. And it's a really tricky process. Even the tenant advocates don't recommend that they go through this process, because one false move and the tenant can actually lose their housing, which is not a great look for them if they're trying to do something. But the tenants have to be current in their rent. They must have communicated with you about the defect and you have failed to commence remedial action or failed to communicate back with them. And they can either complete the work and deduct the amount of money for that it cost from their rental, or they can terminate the rental agreement, or they can put their rent into what's called a rent escrow. Before we jump into collecting rent, there's a couple questions. What about income that relies solely on tips? That's cash income. And I think as long as that's consistent and you can show a reasonably short period of time of consistency, then that's okay. What is the legal recourse for a resident if we do not remediate a maintenance issue within 24 or 48 hours? I think it's the tenant's right to repair is there. They can terminate the rental agreement, or they can try and complete the work themselves. The best thing always is going to be just communicate. Keep an open dialogue with your residents about what is causing the delay in your ability to fix the issue that they have complained about. If it is a life safety issue or imminently hazardous to their health, it's something that you're going to want to fix more quickly or try and prioritize and fix more quickly. And maybe if your supplier is backed up, you have to look at a different supplier or a different mechanism in which to get the supplies that are necessary to fix that. But that's something that you just have to work with on an individual basis based upon the circumstances of each request for maintenance. So let's talk about collecting rent. Rent obviously is due the first of the month, and generally speaking, in your lease agreements, it's considered late the second of the month. At the request of the tenant, a receipt must be provided. You are not required to provide a receipt, but at their request, if they request a receipt, you should be providing them with a receipt. If a tenant pays in cash, a receipt is required. So if you're accepting cash for rent, then a receipt is required. However, there is no legal requirement, and there is no requirement that you accept cash. You can openly refuse to accept cash as a means of paying rent. If a tenant relies on government assistance to pay their rent, so that's SSI or SSDI, that arrives after the rent becomes due, the tenant can actually make a request in writing to change the due date of the rent that's no more than 5 days after the first of the month, or the date that the rent becomes due in the rental agreement. So this was a big change. There was an unintended consequence when we went from a 3-day notice to pay or vacate to a 14-day notice to pay or vacate. Some housing providers in the state adjusted the schedule with which they serve a 14-day notice and began serving that on the 2nd of the month instead of on the 5th or the 6th of the month. And as a result, there's a certain population of folks who are detrimentally affected by having to receive a notice, even though they regularly pay their rent on the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th of the month, because of the fact that they rely exclusively on some sort of government-related assistance to pay their rent in that month. And also, you want to apply any rent payments that are made to the current month of rent owing first, and then apply that to any past rent owing, any late fees, or any other charges that are owing. So you always want to apply any rent payment to the current month's rent first, and then to anything else that they might owe. This includes a payment plan. So if you have a payment plan with your tenant based upon non-payment of rent over the past 2 years, you're going to apply any sort of payment that they make to the current month's rent first until that is satisfied, and then you will apply any other payments to the payment plan that they may have agreed to. Would we have to fill this? Would we have them fill this out as a reasonable accommodation? It could be a reasonable accommodation. That's a great process to go through. It's a pretty cut and dry and straightforward. I mean, you're typically gonna know where their income comes from, because that's how you qualified them. So you'll have that information. You don't need to go into the interactive process like we talked about yesterday when we were talking about furry fair housing and what you might need to do in order to qualify or disqualify a reasonable accommodation. It's simply going to be a basic writing. So if they request it in writing, you pretty much have to accept it. I understood that Social Security date changes was related to when they started receiving it. So that no longer applies then. So yeah, you're right. There are Social Security is actually paid at different times of the month. This was something that changed in about 1997, if you were alive then. There are folks who are grandfathered in after 1997 and still received their money on the 3rd of the month. And there are others who, as a result of the type of Social Security income that they receive, also get their money on the 3rd of the as well. Even though the tenant makes that request for a rent date extension, does the property legally have to accept the written request? As long as it complies with the law, so meaning that the rent due date does not, the request for the change does not exceed 5 days from the current or the rent due date in the lease agreement, then yes, you would have to accept that rental amount or that rental due date change amount. Assessing late fees. So late fees, first of all, late fees cannot be charged until 5 days after the rent becomes due. And I was hoping I might have a slide here for that. Let me see here. Nope. I thought I had a quick example, but I don't. So we're going to just talk through an example. Rent is due on the 1st. It's considered late on the 2nd. You cannot assess late fees to the tenant's ledger on the 2nd. You would need to wait until the 7th to assess late fees. Now, what's a little bit confusing about that is that doesn't mean that, if you're charging a late fee and you're charging a daily fee as well, that doesn't mean that you no longer can collect late fees for the rent being due between the 2nd and the 7th. On the 7th, you can assess those late fees and attach them to the tenant's ledger, and you can roll that back, that late fee back, beginning the 2nd of the month. And so you can move that forward from the 2nd of the month. You just can't assess those late fees until the 5th of the month. You're not going to assess late fees to any rent payments or payments that are made to a payment plan. If it's late, then you're going to move through the process of eviction and proceed under that process, whether that's the eviction resolution pilot program or another mechanism. I recommend that if you're going to go that route, that you contact your attorneys and make sure that you're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's and making sure that you're doing everything correctly that you need to do based upon that default in the payment plan. So of course, we're getting into a piece now where nothing is consistent across the state anymore. So as we move forward, there will be a couple slides like this. They'll be identified as local restrictions, and these are going to apply just to these specific areas. They're not going to apply to the broader state. So if you don't operate in these specific jurisdictions, this slide is not going to apply to you. But so first, in Seattle, late fees are prohibited for 1 year following the end of the state of civil emergency. What is the end? What is the state of civil emergency? The state of civil emergency is effectively what we call the state of emergency, which means that there is a declared emergency that's affecting health or safety. Oftentimes we see these when there's an earthquake or a massive fire, hurricane. These are kind of big, broad examples across the state. I don't know that we've ever had a state of emergency for a disease, but that's what we've been in and are under right now. In Seattle, it's up to the mayor in consultation with the fire chief and police chief to dissolve that state of emergency. And that can go on for an indeterminate period of time. Christopher talked about that a little bit this morning as well in related to some of the Seattle laws. So 1 year following the end of the state of civil emergency in the city of Seattle. So that's a long unknown period of time. In unincorporated King County, typically you're going to see the properties, there's an unincorporated area around Auburn, Skyway, White Center are the really big areas that have an unincorporated piece to them. And look, I think tomorrow, I actually have a nice graphic of unincorporated King County that I wasn't able to get into this slide deck. So shameless plug, join me tomorrow. But in unincorporated King County, late fees are limited to 1.5% of the monthly rent. And in Auburn, if you operate in Auburn, late fees are limited to $10 per month. Let me go back really quickly and talk about unincorporated King County. If you don't know if you're in a city or an unincorporated King County, you can look up whether or not, based upon your address, whether or not you're in unincorporated King County or in a city by just Googling King County Parcel Viewer, or another way to do it is to look at when you call the police. I imagine most, if not all of you, have called the police at one time or another. Who responds? Is it the city of Auburn Police Department responding, or is it the King County Sheriff that's responding? Don't consider that based upon service of an eviction or a writ of restitution. But if you've called 911, who responds, or where do they send you to the dispatch? Is that to the city's police department, or is that to the unincorporated King County? We've got some new late fee questions, so let's talk about that. The new law states the late fees cannot be posted until the 7th of the month, but it looks like you are saying the 5th, 5 days after the 1st. So when you count, it's 5 days after the rent becomes due. So the rent is due on the 1st, it's considered late on the 2nd. So you start counting the 2nd, and you always start at 0 when you count. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That gets you to the 7th of the month, and that's when you would post those late fees. So what day can we charge the late fees? You said 5 days, but then also on the 7th. I just answered that question. We have some rental assistance applications that have been pending for nearly 6 months, but we don't have a promise to pay from them in writing yet. How long are we required to wait? If you're in the queue, and I'm assuming this is in King County, and you haven't paid, I encourage you to continue reaching out to that rental assistance program to find out what a payment date looks like before proceeding. If properties are applying late fees on the 6th, this needs to be changed to the 7th. It's a great statement. For late fees, if our agreement states rent is due on the 1st, but not considered late until the 5th, does this mean we cannot charge our late fee until the 10th of the month? I would have to look at the specific language, or your attorney would have to look at the specific language in your lease in order to, I think, more specifically provide you recommendations or advice on how to serve those late fees. Best process, most leases say that rent is due on the 1st. It's considered late on the 2nd, but you provide a grace period to pay that rent until the 5th of the month. If we sign a TRAP rent payment agreement form from Community Action Council assisting in January 22 that states no new late fees for additional charges will be made for the months covered, do we need to remove the January late fees? Yes, so if you're receiving assistance for January 2022, and that's the agreement that you signed, then yes, you would have to remove those late fees. You wouldn't be able to assess those on the tenant. Unincorporated King County, and for someone on Section 8, does the 1.5% late fee total rent or the 1.5% of their portion? I believe it would be the total rent. How have you assessed? Well, actually, it would be I believe it would be for the tenant's portion, because I'd have to think about that. A part of me wants to say go to the tenant's portion because typically you have received the money from the housing authority already. Did 5160 have language restricting late fees as well? It did, but only at the judgment. So you can only obtain a judgment for late fees of $75. It doesn't actually restrict the collection or charging of late fees. It just restricts a judgment for late fees to $75. That in effect limits late fees to $75. But obviously there are ways to work around that, particularly because you cannot evict for non-payment of late fees anymore. All right. A security deposit. In order to collect a security deposit, there must be a written lease agreement, a written move-in inspection checklist, a trust account to deposit the security deposit, and a written receipt for the security deposit. Here are the critical pieces: a move-in inspection checklist and a written receipt for that security deposit. I bet a lot of these things are provided, but you want to make sure that when you get that move-in inspection checklist, that you also get it back and it's signed by the tenant. That's going to help you in the long run be able to deduct damages that occur beyond normal wear and tear to the unit itself, and collect any other damages that might result from the tenancy. The lease agreement must identify the name and location of the financial institution holding the security deposit. Now, remember the first slide we had today, it said that the RLTA was created in 1973. And in 1973, you might have banked at a big bank, like one of the big box banks that we have. But your bank account was actually held at that local location. It was very specific to that local location. Now it's it's more centralized and much bigger. And if you go to one Bank of America, you're basically going to all of them. And so you can put the Bank of America contact information or whomever you're banking with, their contact information there. You don't need to identify a specific branch of the bank unless your bank is a very specific branched style bank that exists. Local restrictions. Seattle limits the security deposit and other fees to 1 month's rent. Seattle permits you to charge a non-refundable cleaning fee at the initiation of the tenancy, but then cleaning cannot be deducted from the security deposit at the end of the tenancy. And a screening fee. You can charge a screening fee for the cost of your screening at your property. You can't charge any other one-time fees in the city of Seattle. Auburn limits the security deposit to 1 month's rent, and unincorporated King County limits the security deposit and other fees to 1 month's rent. They don't specifically limit the fees themselves. Non-refundable fees. Good segue and good jump. You can charge a holding fee to hold the unit or remove it from the available units in the market. In 2020, that law changed, and a holding fee cannot exceed 25% of the first month's rent. You can also charge an application fee, and it can be equal to the cost of obtaining the tenant screening report. This is something I know for those of you that have operated over the last 5 years, you've seen a shift in the cost of those tenant screening reports where they used to be $30 to $40 or $50. They're now a little bit cheaper. And it's based upon the actual cost that you pay for that tenant screening report. In everywhere except a few specific jurisdictions, you can charge an administrative fee. The law allows you to charge a non-refundable cleaning fee. You can charge early termination fees, and you can charge late fees, as we've discussed. Local restrictions. Like I said, Seattle prohibits non-refundable fees, except that non-refundable cleaning fee or any charges related to screening that do not exceed the cost that you pay to obtain that screening. The city of Auburn prohibits other fees charged in connection with the lease or rental agreement unless the fee is agreed to in writing in the rental agreement. And in unincorporated King County, it limits the security deposit and I put late fees to 1 month's rent, but it's other fees. So it doesn't specifically limit other fees, like the administrative fee, for example, but it does limit the amount that you can charge. So you could still charge an administrative fee if that's permitted by your affordability covenants, or you're able to do that. But together, the security deposit and any other fees cannot exceed 1 month's rent. So you have to do a little bit of addition. Is this technically a holding fee or a refundable holding deposit if it is required to be applied towards the rent or deposit? Yeah, you're right. The holding fee can be applied to the first month's rent or to the deposit. So you could collect a $300 holding fee that would be applied to your the security deposit once they qualify. It has different names, but it has the same effect. The holding fee or holding deposit, if you deny them, you have to return that. There is a way for you to keep that if they decline an offer of tenancy. But you need to make sure that if you're collecting a holding fee, that the terms and conditions are in writing and you're providing that to them when they pay that holding fee as well. Are we still able to charge amenity fees for the fitness centers, club rooms, theater? Can we do that every year at renewal? In Seattle, Michael, well, I don't know that you're still in Seattle, but you were in Seattle. In Seattle, you can't charge any other one-time fees at the initiation of the tenancy. You can charge ongoing fees or regular monthly fees for use of amenities, like the question indicates. But you can't charge a one-time fee. Outside of Seattle, and except in these other jurisdictions as described, you would be able to charge amenity fees for use of different amenities. Can an application fee not exceed the amount of the background check? Yes, the application fee should not exceed the amount that you are paying for the background check that's occurring. See, Michael, he used to be in Seattle, now he's in Bellevue. He's an expat or an ex-Seat. All right, installment payments for move-in costs. 3 months. One more question. Is this technically a holding fee or a refundable holding deposit if it is required to be applied? Oh, I answered that question. All right, installment payments. If the lease is more than, at the state level, if the lease is more than 3 months, you're going to provide, and the tenant, and the security deposit and fees and last month's rent exceed 25% of the first month's rent, then the tenant can pay those charges in 3 consecutive and equal installments beginning at the inception of the tenancy. If it's month to month, then it's 2 consecutive and equal monthly installments, half on the first and half on the second, beginning of the second month. And you can issue a 14-day notice for failure to comply with the terms of the installment payment schedule. But of course, there's a couple local differences. In Seattle, Seattle has a 6-month installment payment schedule. So if the lease is 6 months or more, then it's 6 equal installments. And if it's less than 6 months, then it's 2 equal monthly installments. And again, in Seattle, installment payments are not allowed when the security deposit is less than 25% of the first month's rent. And it's just the security deposit in Seattle because you can't charge any other fees. Of course, you can charge last month's rent, but that is not a common practice among our membership. In unincorporated King County, they have a different policy as well. They permit 6 months. It's very similar to the city of Seattle. But just remember, outside of unincorporated King County and the city of Seattle, you're going to be focused on a 3-month lease. Now, with installment payments, the tenant does have to request the installment payment in writing in order for you to grant or authorize or opt into that program. If they don't do it in writing, then you don't have to accept that. With installment payments, you are eligible to access the landlord mitigation program. Though this is something that probably is never going to be used. It's just not a reliable use of the landlord mitigation fund. But you would have to sue the tenant and get a judgment in finding that the tenant is low income, limited resourced, or experiencing hardship. And then you can submit that judgment for reimbursement to the state. The tenant is actually responsible for repaying the amount that's reimbursed by the state. And of course, eligibility is that the tenant, the move-in costs exceed 25% of the first month's rent. Right of entry, we got there. With right of entry, you must provide at least 2 days notice prior to entering an occupied home. The notice must be posted on the door of the home you are intending to enter. And it must provide the exact time and date of entry or a reasonable range of time of entry, a telephone number the tenant can call to object to entry and request to reschedule. And we recommend that you add a statement that silence is conferred as consent to right of entry. You can enter in an emergency with less than 2 days notice. You want to provide as much reasonable notice as possible, though, when you are seeking to enter in an emergency. The tenant, one of the big things to know is that the tenant cannot unreasonably withhold consent to enter. So they can object to enter, but they cannot unreasonably withhold that consent. Does the 48-hour notice time start as of the time of the posting or start of the midnight of the day? That's a great question. A lot of people consider it a 48-hour notice, but the law actually says 2 days. The best approach to take is to consider 48 hours. So if you're going to enter at 10 p.m. on Thursday, or I'm sorry, 10 a.m. on Thursday, if you're in at 10 p.m. on Thursday, that's not going to work, probably. But you're going to enter at 10 a.m. on Thursday. you're going to want to post that notice at least 48 hours prior to 10 a.m. on prior to 10 a.m. 2 days before. And I have a great little calculating right of entry time. So we use Monday, we'll use Labor Day as a holiday, and you're going to do your annual fire alarm testing and inspection and testing on Thursday. So if you were going to give 48 hours notice, you would need to be providing that notice prior to Monday the 2nd under this calendar, because the 48 hours is not really before the testing is going to begin. And that's the best answer. And the reality is you're probably not going to run around first thing in the morning and deliver those notices across the whole building. So you really want to try and get that notice out with as much time as you can, if at all possible. Got a couple questions here, so let's go back to the calendar. What would you recommend doing when a tenant unreasonably withholds consent for entry, especially when citing COVID? Well, if you're outside Seattle, Kenmore, and Burien right now, I would serve a 10-day notice to comply or vacate for failure to allow for that. Now, it depends on the issue, right? I mean, if it's a water leak, then that's an unreasonable, that's unreasonably withholding consent. Fire alarm testing, the same thing. With COVID, I think it's just really great to message to your membership or to your residents that what your COVID protocols are. Your maintenance technicians and any sort of third-party suppliers are going to be wearing masks. They're going to be wearing a specific type of mask. They're going to wear booties to enter their home, things like that to protect against the spread of COVID if someone has that fear. There are also other opportunities, and it really depends on what the purpose of entering the home is. Sometimes you might be able to say, okay, we're not going to enter your home, but we do have to unlock your door and open the door so that we can hear and see that the fire alarms are being tested and they're operating as they should be in your apartment. Can you give notices earlier than 48? Yeah, of course, you can give notices earlier than 40 hours. It doesn't have to be exactly 48 hours. And the more notice, the better. With permission to enter notice, what would it be? What if a resident claims to have COVID? Would it be illegal to ask for proof of a positive COVID test? Yes, it would. So under the laws in 2021, the legislature passed a law that prevents you from asking about or inquiring of a person's medical status unless that's related to a reasonable accommodation request. So if they say, you give them notice and they say, oh, I have COVID, and you're like, great, you won't be contagious in 5 days. So we're going to give you a notice in 5 days that we're going to come and do whatever we need to do to address that issue. Do weekends count? Yeah, weekends do count. I would just not include holidays, mostly because you're likely not working on a holiday. Maybe you are, but you just want to always make sure my example assumes that you're not working on a holiday. Can you still fine the $100 if the resident denies you entry after a 10-day to comply? If your lease says that you can that they will be fined $100 if they refuse to comply, then yes, you can assess that charge. Duties of the tenant. Here's some important duties of the tenant. They need to keep their occupied part of the premises clean and sanitary. So they can't build up garbage. A lot of times you would consider this issue when a hoarding situation and you're trying to address a hoarding situation. They need to make sure that they're properly disposing of their garbage, recycling, compost, and other waste. That means depositing it into a garbage room or at the garbage cans in the community, depending on the type of community that you have, and making sure that it's bagged. They're not just throwing banana peels on the floor and those kinds of things. Properly use and operate all fixtures provided by landlord. So they can't disassemble the oven and reassemble it for a different use or purpose. They can't destroy, deface, or damage any structure or dwelling. They can't permit a nuisance or commit waste. And they can't engage in drug-related activity on the premises. Some additional ones. They are required to maintain the smoke detector and the carbon monoxide detector, including replacing the batteries where required. Now, I know for a lot of our membership, we provide kind of a courtesy service of either reminding residents to replace their batteries or just doing it yourself, because that's a really great way to maintain your property and make sure that no one's going to have an issue if there's a fire. But under the law, tenants are actually required to maintain the smoke detectors once they move in. They can't engage in activity that is imminently hazardous to the physical safety of other persons, entails any sort of physical assault on another person, which results in an arrest, or has an unlawful use of a firearm or other deadly weapon that results in an arrest. No gang-related activity on the premises, and they must restore the premises to the original condition, except for normal wear and tear. Does a 48-hour time frame start as the posting or midnight the next day? It's going to depend on when you're entering and what sort of time frame you give. When a notice left in the door, resident is home but has not removed the notice, would this fall under silence as conferred as consent? I believe so. If you know that they're home and they haven't left that home for a couple days, then yes. How would you suggest documenting the no given by a resident and verifying that it is a non-qualifying reason for entering the unit? And you do go in. Well, typically they're either going to call you or email you and say, I don't want you to enter my home. One thing that I know is common sometimes is you have a doctor that lives in your community and they work the night shift and they get home and you say that you're going to enter their home at the same time period that they're trying to sleep so they can go back to work the next day. That's a reasonable, I think that's a reasonable objection to make. If they get home at 8 o'clock and at 10 o'clock, when you say you're going to 10 to 12, when you're going to enter their home, they're going to be asleep. That's a reasonable objection to make. And you would talk with them and effectively engage in an interactive process to find a time that would be reasonable. Maybe it's 4 or 5 in the evening, and it might be the last thing that you have to do for the day, but that's when you're going to enter the home. And it's really going to require some sort of an interactive process to find a time that works well for them. In terms of documentation, you're either going to have your emails or you're going to make a note based upon the phone call in the residence file. What about tenants that destroy or deface landscaping? Would that just be a nuisance? The law says they cannot intentionally or negligently destroy or deface or damage any structure or dwelling. Now, obviously in 1973, the law didn't necessarily contemplate 700 unit buildings and those sorts of things. And so it's going to be really a judgment call, I think, and you have a discussion with your attorney about the type of damage that occurs or the consistency with which it occurs. Typically, that's going to be a 10-day notice. From my perspective, that's going to be a 10-day notice that you would serve to address that issue. It's drug-related, including marijuana too. You can certainly prohibit the use of marijuana in your communities or smoking in your communities. So many of us have non-smoking communities and address marijuana use as if it's a smoking issue. Drug use is going to be a tricky one. I mean, if you're going to enforce drug use for maintaining edibles in the community or like other forms of non-smoking things, then that's an issue. Oftentimes you're not going to know that the drug use is occurring unless they're like selling drugs, which is, illegal in the state of Washington. What do we do if we know if it's causing damage, we cannot prove it? If you know that someone's causing damage, but you can't prove it, you're kind of in a bind, right? I mean, you're going to need to figure out how you can prove who's causing the damage. One way that I just think of off the top of my head is there's a lot of wireless security camera systems that exist now where you can post the wireless camera and it might be able to record what's happening in a specific area. You would, I believe you would have to include or provide notification that there's some sort of monitoring occurring with those cameras, but that's one opportunity to catch the person with their hand in the cookie jar. All right. Rent increases. Christopher did a really great job today of talking about the rent increases in the city of Seattle. And so when we get to the city of Seattle, I'm going to kind of gloss over that a little bit. But we'll start at the state level. At the state level, all rent increases require at least 60 days notice, regardless of the time frame. A rent increase does not become effective until the end of the current term. So if you have a lease, a resident that's on a lease for a 12-month term and you serve them a rent increase more than 60 days prior to the end of that term, it's not going to become effective until the end of that term, unless you've negotiated that language in the lease somehow. You have some sort of acceleration clause in the lease. If you have I used this example with someone the other day. So if you have a resident who's maybe in public housing, this is where it's most frequent, and their rent is going to change frequently based upon their income, then they only need to be provided with 30 days notice. And where this is most typical is where the rent is conditioned on 30% of that tenant's income instead of a market or some other rent restriction program. So this 30-day notice period is really only applicable to where you've got a tenant whose rent is conditioned on them paying 30% of their income a month toward that rent. It's not going to be related to the MFT program or some other rental restriction program, affordability, low-income housing tax credit, any sort of affordability covenant that restricts the amount of rent that you can increase. It is not necessarily going to apply to. It's only going to apply where that tenant is required to pay a certain percentage of their rent or of their income to rent, and that's going to fluctuate. Locally, we talked about this morning in the city of Seattle, requiring 180 days notice for all rent increase. City of Kenmore requires 90 days notice for rent increases that exceed 10%. The city of Auburn requires 120 days notice for rent increases exceeding 5%. And in unincorporated King County, 120 days notice for rent increases that exceed 3%. So we're going to talk about a couple very specific issues right now. One is domestic violence, and then the other is death of a tenant, or the deceased tenant statute. With domestic violence, tenants have a right to terminate their lease upon certain conditions. They can also do a couple other things. So one, they can ask that you change the locks. They could be charged for that. Typically, you would just do that to protect that tenant based upon the act of domestic violence that occurred. They can also terminate the lease within 90 days of the reported act and prior to the end of the term without a penalty. So you can't charge a lease break fee or anything like that. You would terminate that lease. The survivor or the tenant is entitled to return of the security deposit less any deductions for cleaning or repairs or damages that exceed normal wear and tear. So you would engage in the same process that you do when you have another move out, and you could deduct that process. We're hoping to make some change to that in 2022, but we'll see. In order for this to work and in order for the tenant to exercise that right that they have in the law, they must provide you with one of the following. One is an order of protection that they've obtained from their local court or your local court, or a statement or letter from a qualified third party. A qualified third party can be a police officer, it can be an advocate, and it just has to follow the standard form that exists in the statute. It's important to note that the notification must be in writing. If the perpetrator of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or unlawful harassment is an employee of the property, then the tenant may vacate and terminate the lease and provide the above documentation after they've terminated and vacated the apartment, but they have to do that within 7 days of vacating. Is the tenant charged for damage that occurred from a DV dispute? If the tenant is the tenant, the rent responsible tenant on the lease under the law, yes, you can charge and deduct that amount from the tenant's security deposit, and even potentially going after them for collections. Is that the right thing to do? No, it's not. But that is what the law says. And that's something that we're trying to change to provide you with compensation, but also to provide support for survivors of domestic violence, so that they can start new in a new life outside of the domestic violence situation. That's something that we're focusing on in this legislative session. It had a really amazing hearing on Tuesday. Yes, is that yesterday? Yeah, yesterday morning. And we're excited to see the bill move forward. It has almost 40 co-sponsors in the House. So what the bill does is it permits the landlord to return the security deposit in full to the survivor, and then you could seek up to $5,000 in damages from the landlord mitigation fund as a result of their termination based upon the domestic violence statute. So that's what the law would do. Death of a tenant. This is a really kind of complicated area, and I'm gonna just jump through it pretty quickly because it requires a little bit of process. We have a great summary in the book that we created for you, but I would also recommend that if you're going down this process, that you also reach out to your attorney to make sure you're doing everything correctly. At the initiation of the tenancy or during the tenancy, that you can ask, but you cannot require a tenant to sign what they call a designated person form. A designated person form provides access to the rental unit or the apartment home, receive funds from the deceased tenant, and permits them the ability to dispose of property consistent with the last will. If there's a personal representative, then the authority of the designated survivor or designated person terminates. So there's kind of it becomes complicated when you get into a state law who becomes responsible, but you can have someone sign this designated person form. When you discover that one of your residents has passed away and they live alone, you can enter the unit to dispose of perishable items or turn over any animals to the tenant representative, animal control, the police, or some other organization if there are animals that are left in the unit. You want to begin by mailing notice to the tenant's address, their emergency contact, and the tenant representatives, stating, providing information about the lease agreement. When is rent paid through, that the lease will terminate, and permitting the landlord to take possession of items if the lease terminates without any sort of action from either the personal representative or the designated person. They can continue to hold that unit for 60 days, provided that they pay rent. And there are certain forms that were created by the law in order to address these issues. If you get no response, you can remove that personal property, and you do need to store it for a few days. You can charge commercial storage rates to keep that furniture. If the property then is less than $1,000, it can be disposed of after that 60-day period. If it's more than $1,000, you can sell it for fair market value and hold the proceeds of that for 1 year. You really want to hold on if you find personal effects, photos, different things like that. You want to hold on to those for at least 90 days. I have a city, kind of specific cities where you really want to focus on specific actions or specific laws. That's Seattle, Kenmore, Auburn, Burien, Tacoma has their own rental housing code. Obviously, we've talked about unincorporated King County today, and Federal Way has a very specific just cause provision as well. So that's my last slide this morning. I'll go through a couple questions here and over the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up and we'll see you tomorrow. In the materials provided, it states that if the victim is a roommate and they leave with the conditions satisfied, the housing provider can refund the entire security deposit, and then remaining roommates will pay any charges out of pocket at move out. Is this correct? Yes, it is. Yeah. My mentor told me that it's a really good practice if you have a tenant who terminates their lease based upon domestic violence, and there are other tenants that are going to remain and become responsible for the lease, that you still refund that security deposit to that survivor. Who is a qualified third party to provide a letter regarding the DV? It's identified in the statute. A qualified third party is typically like a police officer, a therapist, an advocate who supports domestic survivors of domestic violence. Many of you know that we work with Domestic Abuse Women's Network, or DAWN. They're an advocacy organization that provides advocates to support survivors and also provide services to them so that they can transition from a period in their life of abuse to outside of that. But typically you're going to get that, and there is a standard form in the statute that they're going to use in order to provide that testament that an act of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or unlawful harassment has occurred. Do we have to hold the belongings for a deceased tenant for 60 days? What if the entire home and all belongings are not salvageable as determined by biohazard? If that's the case, then you would dispose of those items. It's not, if there's a biohazard issue, you're not going to hold on to those issues because that's going to create another biohazard issue. Yeah, I mean, you're going to want to get rid of the things that are going to cause some sort of a hazard, whether that's food that's left over or some other things that are going to create more of a hazard in the home or hazard for having to store them. If the person passed away in the bed, then that's probably you're not going to keep the mattress, for example. You're going to toss that. That has no value. It's not worth it. And we could go down a really different place with a lot of things there. So, you know, if it's not salvageable, you don't have to keep that. All right, Sloanie.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. We thank you. You know, we had a comment that I just want to touch on because I think it is important. We have a lot of new people that enter our industry at different times. And so we kind of tend to, over the last several sessions, we've gotten a lot of questions around source of income. And we just want to make clear that source of income is a protected class in the entire state of Washington. So when we keep coming back to, but what about this kind of income? What about this kind of income? All income sources are protected class. And so we just want to make that really clear. It's not really that confusing when you look at it that way. But people join at different times, join the industry and join their career. So it sometimes can be confusing or new information to them. Somebody's asking about the links and resources. So the platform that you go to for this seminar this week, where you can see each day's sessions, you can click on the specific session, and in that session, there'll be a links and resources tab. That's where you can find, by the end of the day, the PowerPoint slide, the recording, and for today's session, that copy of the RLTA summary, and that is in there. So that is there. Again, I want to thank our friends at Star Staffing for supporting all of you and helping us bring this presentation to you. Michael, you're amazing. Michael Taylor, my next comment is to say, if you enjoyed these sessions, but virtual is not enough for you, we have an in-person networking event tomorrow afternoon, right in Renton, centrally located. Tapas and Topics will be happening at a Griffiths property there, Lake Washington building, and I'm going to put the link to the registration. This is free for members, and so you can but we just need you to RSVP so we can plan for food and all that good stuff. But yeah, we'd love for you to join us. We still have room. It's a great time, beginning of the year, to get together. We can talk about those New Year's resolutions that we may or may not be keeping at this point in time. And we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be covering just cause evictions with the Armitage and Thompson team. And then Brett will be bringing us home with his post-moratorium operations session. So definitely join us for that. I want to give away our Tango gift card for today. So we try to give away a gift card in each session to thank you for joining us live and in person, and not just waiting for the recording, because we count on your questions and your interaction to help drive it. And so today I picked the first person to answer our New Year's resolution question, and that was Kelly Irons, Buddha, who's trying to drink more water. And so Kelly, you get the gift card. We'll be sending that to you via email. It's a Tango gift card, which lets you go pick a gift card for anything you want. Ulta, Sephora, Amazon, DoorDash, whatever. You get to pick your poison on that. So any parting comments, Brett?
I've got nothing. Stay
got
tuned.
nothing.
We're trying to, it's a busy week this week here at WMFHA, but we're trying to get a legislative update out so that you've got some knowledge of what's happening in the legislature. I had planned on doing it today, but that may not come until later this week, just to talk about what's been introduced, what's happening in the legislature, and when you can expect to see if there might be some changes occurring in a few months. So keep track of that. We've already had a couple hearings this week. We've got one more tomorrow, and then I'll say the week is over. It's not, but we don't have any more hearings this week. But we're tracking a lot of different stuff in 2022.
Yeah, definitely watch your emails and then watch our blog listing, because Brett will always do a nice kind of recap of things you need to know. And also our government affairs resources on our website. But yeah, we thank you for being here today, and we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow to wrap it up. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day.